Picture this. You come home after a long day at work, expecting to find your family safe and sound. Instead, you walk into your living room and witness something so horrifying, so unimaginable, that your mind can't even process what you're seeing. Your 19-year-old son, with your own mother. That single moment of discovery would destroy 3 lives forever. Tonight, we uncover the disturbing case that shocked a small American town, where betrayal led to murder, and a family was torn apart by secrets too dark to bear. This is the story of Margaret Thompson, her son David, and the grandmother who paid the ultimate price for a forbidden act. Before we continue deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and families who'd lived there for generations. The Thompson family seemed to fit right in. Margaret Thompson, 42 years old, had spent her entire adult life working double shifts at the local diner to provide for her family. After her husband walked out when David was just 10 years old, she'd moved back in with her mother, Eleanor, to make ends meet. Eleanor Thompson was 68, a retired schoolteacher who'd raised Margaret in that same house on Elm Street. 3 generations under one roof. It should have been a blessing. For years it was. Margaret would work the morning shift, come home to help David with homework, while Eleanor cooked dinner and shared stories about the old days. David was always a quiet kid, maybe a little too attached to his grandmother, but Margaret chalked it up to the absence of a father figure. Eleanor had been the one to teach him to ride a bike, help him with school projects, and comfort him during nightmares. She was more than a grandmother. She was his anchor. But David had been struggling lately. At 19, he'd dropped out of community college, couldn't hold down a job, and spent most of his time at home. Margaret worried about him, but Eleanor always defended her grandson. "He just needs time to find himself," she'd say, stroking his hair as he sat beside her on the couch, watching television late into the night. On September 15th, Margaret's shift at the diner ended early. The lunch rush had been slow, and her manager sent her home at 3 in the afternoon. She drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook, thinking about the grocery list Eleanor had given her that morning. She pulled into the driveway of their modest 2-story home, noting that David's car was still parked out front. Good, she thought. Maybe he'd finally gotten around to looking for work like they'd discussed. Margaret used her key to unlock the front door, calling out, "I'm home early," as she stepped inside. The house was unusually quiet. No television, no radio, no sound of Eleanor humming in the kitchen as she usually did in the afternoons. Margaret set her purse down on the hall table and walked toward the living room. And that's when she saw them. Her son David, 19 years old, was on the couch with Eleanor, not sitting beside her watching television, not helping her with something. They were together. In a way that made Margaret's stomach lurch and her vision blur. Eleanor, her own mother, the woman who had raised her, taught her right from wrong, was with her son. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to process what she was witnessing. The room seemed to spin around her. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Not in her house. Not with her family. David noticed her first, scrambling to cover himself, his face flushed with shame and panic. Eleanor sat up slowly, her eyes meeting Margaret's with an expression that wasn't shock or shame, but defiance. "Margaret," Eleanor said calmly, as if she'd been caught doing nothing more than reading a book, "you're home early." Those words, that calm, matter-of-fact tone, something inside Margaret snapped. The betrayal, the disgust, the years of working herself to the bone while her own mother was doing this with her son. The screaming started then. Margaret heard her own voice as if it belonged to someone else, demanding to know how long this had been going on, how they could do this to her, how they could do this to their family. David tried to stammer out explanations, excuses, but Eleanor just sat there, adjusting her clothes with an eerie composure. "You don't understand," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "David needed someone who understands him, someone who truly cares about him." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Her own mother, justifying the unthinkable. Her own son, unable to meet her eyes. The arguing escalated quickly. Margaret demanded that David pack his things and leave. Eleanor refused to let him go. "He's staying here," Eleanor declared, standing up and placing a protective hand on David's shoulder. "This is his home too." That's when Margaret saw the kitchen knife on the coffee table. Eleanor had been slicing apples earlier. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, Margaret lunged forward. The call came into Millbrook Police Department at 4:37 p.m. Neighbors had heard screaming, shouting, and what sounded like furniture being knocked over. When officers arrived at the Thompson house on Elm Street, they found the front door wide open. David Thompson was sitting on the front porch steps, his head in his hands, still only partially clothed. He looked up as the officers approached, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "She's inside," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother. She's inside. My mom killed her." Officer James Bradley was the first to enter the house. The living room showed signs of a struggle. Overturned coffee table, scattered magazines, and Eleanor Thompson's body on the floor beside the couch. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. The kitchen knife lay beside her, covered in blood. Margaret Thompson was found in the kitchen, sitting at the table where she'd shared thousands of meals with her mother and son. Her hands were covered in blood, and she was staring blankly at the wall. When Officer Bradley approached her, she looked up at him with empty eyes and said, "I walked in on them. My own mother, with my own son. I just couldn't let it continue." The initial investigation seemed straightforward. Margaret Thompson had discovered her 19-year-old son in a sexual relationship with her mother, Eleanor. In a fit of rage and disgust, she had killed Eleanor with a kitchen knife. David corroborated the basic facts. Yes, he had been involved with his grandmother. Yes, his mother had walked in on them. Yes, his mother had attacked Eleanor in a rage. But as Detective Linda Morris began interviewing the family members and neighbors, disturbing questions began to emerge. How long had this relationship been going on? Who had initiated it? And most troubling of all, had Eleanor Thompson been a willing participant, or had she been a victim of something much more complex and dark? 3 days after the murder, David Thompson's story began to change. During his second interview with Detective Morris, he broke down completely. Through tears, he revealed that the relationship with his grandmother had been going on for over 2 years, since he was 17 years old. But the details he provided painted a picture that was far more complex than anyone had initially understood. "She started it," David sobbed, his hands shaking as he spoke. "After I turned 17, she said I reminded her of my grandfather when he was young. She said it was natural, that it was what families did to take care of each other." Detective Morris felt her stomach turn as David continued. "She would come to my room at night, after my mom went to work the morning shift. She said it was our special secret, that my mom wouldn't understand because she was too cold, too distant. She said I was the only one who really loved her." The revelation changed everything. Had Eleanor Thompson been the victim of her grandson's inappropriate advances? Or had she been the predator who groomed a vulnerable teenager? David's account suggested that Eleanor had initiated the relationship when he was still a minor, manipulating him emotionally and sexually. But without Eleanor alive to tell her side of the story, the truth became even more elusive. Margaret Thompson's defense attorney, Robert Kane, immediately seized on this new information. If Eleanor had indeed groomed and sexually abused David since he was 17, then Margaret's actions could be seen not just as a crime of passion, but as a mother protecting her child from ongoing abuse. But the prosecution wasn't convinced. District Attorney Sarah Mills argued that David's story was convenient, coming forward only after his grandmother was dead, and couldn't defend herself. "He's trying to make himself look like a victim," Mills told the press, when the real victim is Eleanor Thompson, who died unable to speak for herself. The community of Millbrook was torn apart by the revelations. Some believed David's account, seeing him as a young man who had been manipulated and abused by a trusted family member. Others believed that David was lying, trying to avoid responsibility for his part in a consensual but horrific relationship. And at the center of it all was Margaret Thompson, sitting in county jail, charged with second-degree murder, having to face the possibility that she had killed her mother, either to stop ongoing abuse or in a moment of misguided rage. But investigators soon uncovered a detail that would change the case once again. David wasn't just a witness to his grandmother's death. Phone records showed that in the weeks before the murder, he had been researching something that suggested this tragedy might not have been as spontaneous as it appeared. Detective Morris was methodical in her investigation, understanding that the truth in this case was buried under layers of family dysfunction, secrecy, and trauma. She began by examining David Thompson's internet search history, cell phone records, and personal belongings. What she discovered was disturbing. In the 3 weeks leading up to Eleanor's murder, David had made dozens of searches related to ending inappropriate relationships, how to stop family abuse, and most tellingly, what happens if someone finds out about incest. He had also visited online forums where young men discussed inappropriate relationships with older family members. In several posts, David had written about feeling trapped, ashamed, and desperate to end a situation he described as something that started when I was too young to understand, and now I can't escape. Dr. Patricia Wells, a forensic psychologist, was brought in to evaluate David's mental state and the likelihood of his claims about being groomed by Eleanor. Her assessment was complex and troubling. David exhibits many of the psychological markers consistent with long-term sexual abuse, Dr. Wells reported to the court. His emotional attachment to Eleanor, combined with his shame and confusion about their relationship, suggests a pattern of grooming that likely began when he was still developing psychologically. But Dr. Wells also noted inconsistencies in David's story. There are elements of his account that suggest he may have been a more willing participant than he claims, particularly as he got older. The relationship appears to have continued well into his adult years, which complicates the victim narrative. Meanwhile, neighbors began coming forward with their own observations about the Thompson family. Mrs. Helen Garcia, who lived next door, told police that she had often seen Eleanor and David together in ways that made her uncomfortable. "They would sit very close on the porch swing in the evenings," she said, "closer than a grandmother and grandson should sit. And the way she would touch his face, stroke his hair, it didn't look like normal grandmotherly affection." Tom Bradley, who worked at the hardware store where David occasionally shopped, recalled strange conversations. He would come in sometimes looking really upset, really troubled. One time he asked me about locks for bedroom doors, said he needed privacy from his family. Another time he asked about security cameras, said he wanted to protect himself, but wouldn't say from what. The forensic evidence from Eleanor's body revealed additional troubling information. Medical examiner Dr. Robert Chen discovered that Eleanor had been sexually active recently, and DNA evidence confirmed that her partner had been David. But more disturbing was evidence that suggested the sexual activity had been frequent and ongoing. The house itself told a story of dysfunction that went beyond the immediate crime. Eleanor's bedroom contained items that suggested she had been trying to maintain a younger appearance. Hair dye, makeup, clothing more appropriate for someone decades younger. David's room showed signs of someone who had been living in emotional turmoil. Journals filled with confused, contradictory entries about love, guilt, shame, and family loyalty. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before the murder, read, "I don't know what's right anymore. She says she loves me, that we're helping each other, but I feel sick inside. I want it to stop, but I don't know how to make it stop without destroying everything. What if Mom finds out? What if everyone finds out? I wish I could just disappear." Another entry, more recent, was even more disturbing. "Mom's been asking questions about why I don't date, why I spend so much time with Grandma. I think she's starting to figure something out. I'm scared of what will happen when she learns the truth. I'm scared of what I might do. I'm scared of what Grandma might do. I don't know how this ends, but I know it ends badly." The investigation also revealed that Margaret had been noticing changes in her family dynamics for months before the fatal discovery. Co-workers at the diner reported that Margaret had seemed increasingly stressed and worried about her home situation. "She would talk about David being too dependent on his grandmother," said Linda Martinez, who worked alongside Margaret for 3 years. "She said it wasn't healthy for a young man to spend so much time with an elderly woman, that he needed to get out and meet people his own age." The trial of Margaret Thompson began on a cold February morning, 6 months after Eleanor Thompson's death. The courtroom was packed with residents of Millbrook, family members, and media from across the region. The case had captured national attention as people struggled to understand how a family could be destroyed by such dark secrets. Prosecutor Sarah Mills painted Margaret as a woman who had committed cold-blooded murder in a moment of uncontrolled rage. Margaret Thompson walked into her house, saw something that disgusted her, and decided that her mother deserved to die, Mills argued. She didn't call the police. She didn't try to get help for what she viewed as an abusive situation. She picked up a knife and stabbed a 68-year-old woman to death. That's not justice. That's murder. Defense attorney Robert Kane presented a different narrative. Margaret Thompson discovered that her minor son had been sexually groomed and abused by her own mother for years. The shock, the betrayal, the realization that the woman she trusted most in the world had been harming her child. It caused a psychological break that led to a tragic but understandable response. The testimony was heartbreaking and disturbing. David took the stand and, through tears, described years of confusion, manipulation, and abuse. "She told me it was love," he said, his voice barely audible. "She told me that families took care of each other this way, that it was special, that it was our secret. I was 17 when it started. I didn't understand what was happening to me." Under cross-examination, however, David's story became more complicated. Prosecutor Mills pressed him about why he hadn't sought help, why he had continued the relationship into his adult years, why he had seemed to be a willing participant. "You were 19 years old when your mother found you," Mills said. "You were an adult. You could have left. You could have stopped this at any time." David broke down completely on the stand. "You don't understand," he sobbed. "She made me feel like I needed her. Like no one else would ever understand me or love me the way she did. She made me feel like it was the only real relationship I could ever have. I was trapped." Margaret herself testified, describing the moment that changed her life forever. "I walked into that room and saw my mother, with my son, and something inside me just broke," she said, tears streaming down her face. "All I could think about was how long this had been going on, how my mother had betrayed me, how my son had been hurt in ways I couldn't even comprehend. I didn't plan to hurt her. I couldn't let it continue. I couldn't let her keep destroying him." The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was complex and reflected the complicated nature of the case. Margaret Thompson was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than second-degree murder, acknowledging that while her actions were criminal, they were committed in the heat of passion after discovering an unthinkable family situation. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 8 years. 3 years have passed since Eleanor Thompson's death, and the community of Millbrook is still struggling to heal from the tragedy that exposed the darkest secrets of a seemingly normal family. Margaret Thompson is serving her sentence at the State Women's Correctional Facility, participating in counseling programs and maintaining her innocence of any intent to kill. According to her attorney, she continues to believe that she was protecting her son from ongoing abuse, and she expresses deep regret, not for her mother's death, but for not recognizing the signs of abuse earlier. David Thompson has left Millbrook and is reportedly living under a different name in another state. He has undergone extensive therapy and counseling to address the psychological trauma of his childhood and adolescent experiences. His current whereabouts are kept confidential for his protection and privacy. The case has raised difficult questions about the nature of abuse, consent, and family dynamics that mental health professionals are still debating. Dr. Patricia Wells, the forensic psychologist who evaluated David, has written extensively about the case, noting that it illustrates the complex ways that sexual abuse can manifest within families, particularly when it involves multi-generational trauma and grooming that begins in adolescence. The Thompson family home on Elm Street has been sold, and new residents have moved in, unaware of the tragedy that occurred there. Neighbors still struggle with questions about what they might have seen or suspected, and whether there were signs that could have prevented the ultimate tragedy. Some have reported feeling guilty about not speaking up about behavior they noticed, but dismissed as merely unusual. The case has also sparked conversations in Millbrook about the importance of recognizing signs of abuse and the resources available to families in crisis. The local school district has implemented new programs to educate students about inappropriate relationships and provide confidential reporting mechanisms for young people who may be experiencing abuse at home. But perhaps the most haunting question remains unanswered. Was Eleanor Thompson a predator who groomed her own grandson, or was she herself a victim of a young man who manipulated her loneliness and vulnerability? The truth died with Eleanor, leaving behind only the devastated lives of those who survived, and a community forever changed by the knowledge that the darkest secrets can hide behind the most ordinary facades. How do you separate victim from perpetrator when the relationship itself defies every norm of family, morality, and law? How do you judge a mother who killed to protect her child, even if that protection came too late and at too high a cost? These are questions that the Thompson family tragedy forces us to confront, even when we'd rather look away. The case reminds us that families aren't always the safe havens we imagine them to be, and that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of the deepest betrayals. It challenges our understanding of justice, protection, and the limits of what a parent might do when faced with the unthinkable. She walked into her own home expecting normalcy, and discovered a betrayal so profound that it ended in death. Margaret Thompson's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about family, abuse, and the thin line between protection and murder. In the end, a 68-year-old woman was dead, a 19-year-old man was traumatized beyond measure, and a mother was imprisoned for trying to stop what she saw as the destruction of her son. But the question that haunts this case remains: when Margaret Thompson picked up that kitchen knife, was she committing murder, or was she finally desperately trying to save her child from years of abuse? What would you have done if you walked into that room? How do you process discovering that the two people you love most in the world have been living a lie that destroys everything you thought you knew about your family? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this case challenges every assumption we make about family loyalty, protection, and justice. And if this story has affected you, remember that help is available for anyone dealing with family abuse or trauma. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak up, ask for help, and break the silence that allows these tragedies to continue. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next case that reminds us that truth is often stranger and more tragic than fiction.